to speak about her family's history in the face of apartheid is senior Sheena Holt.
It's World War II. A poor British kid, not much older than me, is sent to fight in the Royal Navy. It takes him to Egypt due to the Suez Canal, and eventually he finds his way to South Africa. He's never left Britain before, never seen a world outside of Leeds. He is captivated by the possibility and opportunity that comes with joining the Navy, and after the war, decides to stay. In South Africa, he makes money farming, breeding, and racing horses, and eventually becomes quite successful working in imports from ships entering Durban. He meets a Boer or Dutch South African woman, marries her, and has a son. He has found his place in South Africa. He has fallen in love, made a family, created an empire, and lived a life. He dies in 1991, right as apartheid is at its end. South Africa was my grandfather Rusty's land of opportunity, one which his unique British identity granted him. Being white allowed him to survive in South Africa, but it was his unique British privilege with a passport and thus mobility that allowed him to thrive in the first place. While race can give us privilege within a nation, it is mobility that grants us the ability to use it. From the 1920s to 1994, South Africa had been under the system of apartheid, an intense form of segregation used to ensure the subjugation of Black Africans. Laws did not just divide Black from white, but Black from mixed, white from Asian, and to some extent, Boer from British. Perhaps most interestingly for my specific story were the pass laws, a series of laws which mandated that Black or mixed race Africans carry booklets with their personal information with them to be presented to white officials at any time or upon reaching checkpoints of travel. Rusty hid a young Musa boy from the police who was hiding because he didn't have sufficient documentation. Later on, Julius was attacked by other Musa for working on official strike days, his hands slashed to prevent him from working the next day. In the 1990s, rising political tension internally and pressure from the international community led to the sudden overturn of apartheid government for democracy under Mandela. But decades of ingrained segregation and violence are hard to wash away overnight. While my dad was a teenager, he saw some of this violence firsthand. One day, he was driving to school with his maternal grandfather. Coming to an intersection, he saw a man burning in the street under the necklacing tactic. When a person was seen as a sellout to the white government, they would be attacked by a group of militants who would bind their arms and place a tire over their neck. They would fill the tire with petroleum, set it on fire, burning the person to death. Necklacing and other violent tactics were somewhat common at this point in South Africa's history. While my father was usually away from this, the violence he saw is still planted in his mind. Due to the violence and instability that accompanied South Africa's move to democracy, many of the white citizens of South Africa were genuinely afraid that a transfer of power would mean vengeance upon them as it happened when power was transferred to the Black citizens of Zimbabwe before it. Hundreds of thousands of white South Africans fled the nation in the years following 1994, mostly for Australia and the United Kingdom. My father, his siblings, and my grandmother due to marriage were some of those who left. While South Africa was Rusty's land of opportunity, for my father and his siblings, it represented at best stagnation and at worst oppression. While most of my father's family lived in South Africa in the 80s, as of today, only my great-uncle remains. South Africa, like many other once Commonwealth nations, is still largely painted by the hand of British imperialism. British rule has artificially created borders, customs, and language assimilation in almost every region it has touched. For ethnic Brits, however, the positives seem to outweigh the negatives. My father had essential freedom to go wherever he wanted after the fall of apartheid. If he was Black or completely Boer, this wouldn't have been possible. South Africa today faces corrupt political leadership, often driven by other westernized nations. While its economy has grown substantially, its unemployment rate grew to 27% in 2018. Average people seldom feel the benefits of their nation's increase in GDP. While my father was starting his career in technology in the UK and then later in the US, his friends back in South Africa were struggling to make ends meet. Mobility is not just a transient tool used to go on vacations. It's an economically and ethnically based privilege, often fatally overlooked. What should be a natural right is reserved only for the privileged within a society or within the international community. In the same way that moving to South Africa was my grandfather's pursuit of happiness, moving to the US was my dad's. Just last year, he received his American citizenship, and it was one of the happiest days my family has had in the past few years. I don't believe I would have the same privilege I have in the United States if my father had remained in South Africa. His ethnic, not only his racial background, has had such a profound influence in my life, it is hard not to acknowledge the privilege which it has afforded me. My family has the essential freedom to go wherever we want and move around at our convenience. If we were of a different ethnic or economic background, immigration would not be so easy a process. It is something for which many are forced to risk their lives or separate their families. It's 2019. A girl from California, barely 18, is in the midst of choosing what direction her life will take. Will she move to Boston or Memphis? Will she become a writer or a politician? Will she stay in America or move abroad? Will she use her British passport to move back to England? Find work in France? Maybe even move back to Africa? To me, privilege is not only our given identities, whether that be race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. Privilege is also what we have the opportunity to do. My grandfather was a white man in England, but so was everyone else. He was poor, which was really all that mattered. But when he moved to South Africa, his whiteness became a privilege which he was able to take advantage of, one which was passed down to my father. My privilege may be the color of my skin, my religion, or my sexual orientation, but it's also having the opportunity to choose what I want for a career or to move where I want to. In many ways, I still benefit from the same things my grandfather and my father before me benefited from. Privilege is not only our place within a nation. Privilege is also determined by what we have the opportunity to do, our position in the international community, and our ability to determine that position for ourselves. Thank you.